Hi friends, I'm going to read the last two chapters in part two, chapters 35 and 36. Due to an unfortunate and accidental spoiler alert, we might know something that's about to happen, but let's get all the details. All right, so chapter 35, Saturday, February 14th, 1778. And this is an act of the Connecticut Governor and Council of Safety, July 7th, 1777. Colonel John Ely was ordered to dismiss a Negro slave owned by Joseph Crandall from his regiment to return to said Crandall, and his premium arms, etc., to be returned before his dismission. Bellingham rode his horse alongside the wagon that the guard had dumped me in. I sat next to a cask of flour and a small chest of tea. He spoke. My ears were stopped up with snow and anger and blood. And then we were standing in front of the back door to Moore Hall. And the horse was gone, the wagon gone. He reached around me, opened the door. And then I was sitting in a chair before a kitchen hearth. An old cook with twisted fingers set a steaming bowl afore me. I picked up the bowl and sipped. My hands were no longer shackled together, but it felt like they were. My feet were dry, but my bones were ice. I drank all the broth. My head laid itself on the table, and I was no longer master of my own body, of my head, of my heart. And somewhere, my father was angry, and I did not know how to explain. My eyes closed themselves. I will kill Bellingham. Chapter 36, Saturday, February 14th, 1778. This is a quote from Mary Prince, born 1778, the first woman to write about her life in slavery. She says, "The man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person." When I woke, the clouds were scurrying to cover the late afternoon sun. The food and sleep had drained the befuddlement from my head. It hurt some when I stood up, but I could see and think clear. A stocky lad carrying a jar and a dirty polishing rag entered the kitchen of Moore Hall. He was taller than me, but not too many years older. His eyes were set far apart from each other and bulged a bit, like a frog's. His shoes were polished, both the leather and the fat pewter buckles. Spotless white stockings fit tight to his calves. His breeches were black wool and appeared tailored to his form. He wore a tobacco-colored waistcoat over a linen shirt as white as snow, the sleeves of it rolled up so that he might work without making it dirty. Had his skin been white, I would have figured him for a manservant, working for one of the congressmen. As his skin was as dark as mine, it was more likely that he was a slave. "Your master will see you now," he said. The crest was not long enough for me to reckon where he came from. New England, the South, the Middle States, or across the ocean. "My name is Curzon," I said. "You?" He moved a wooden box on the shelf to the side. "How did you come to be here?" I asked. He placed the jar on a high shelf. "I was sent to fetch you, not to stand about jawing." "Who is your master?" He folded the rag and set it aside the jar. "You will follow me." He led me to a dining room converted to be a useful place for the men of the Congress. Mirrors were hung opposite the windows to strengthen the last rays of the sun. Dim portraits glared down from the walls lit by guttering candles and wax-covered sconces. The long table was completely covered with books, half-burnt candlesticks, hills of papers, and an enormous map. I could not read the words at the top of the papers, but I recognized numbers, long columns of numbers that were added up to great sums. The room was cold, the fire dying. Bellingham sat at the far end of the table. "Ah," he said, looking up from the papers before him. "Resurrected at last. Fetch some wood for the fire, Gideon. The maid has neglected it again." Gideon was this fellow's name. He nodded and gave a courteous "sir" before gliding through the door and closing it behind him without a sound. Bellingham set down his pen and waved me closer. "Let me see what damage that buffoon did to your pate, Pat." I walked the length of the table, bent at the waist so he could peer at my head, then stood again. "You'll heal," he said. "It's not deep." I said nothing. He sat back in the chair and sighed. "This is for the best. You'll see that in time." I stared, imagining his wrists in shackles, a noose lowered over his head, kicking away the stool that he stood upon, the sound the rope would make as it snapped his neck. "We're crowded here, but it's better than that frozen hovel on the hill. You'll have decent clothes and food. He waited for a reply, but still I said nothing. Any words I spoke would surely earn me a fierce beating. I did not yet have control of my mouth or temper. The silence of the room was broken by Gideon, who entered carrying a scant armload of firewood. He deposited it by the hearth and knelt to revive the fire, but Bellingham waved him away. Leave that, Bellingham said. Remind the cook that the gentlemen will be hungry when they arrive and that she ought heat up some wash water for Curzon, and send the maid in. Gideon stood and inclined his head. Yes, sir. Bellingham waited until Gideon had again disappeared. Then he stretched his arms above his head once and yawned. The maid takes care of the mending and washing and whatever else is needed. My mouth remained locked. I would not be goaded into conversating with him to act as if all was well and natural. Gideon is on loan to the committee from one of the congressmen in York. He has struggled to properly serve the 5 of us. Your help will be most welcome. He'll show you the lay of the house and explain our routines. It will be much like our time in New York, only with more coats to brush and boots to clean. He speared a cold potato with his fork and bit it. Where is that blasted girl? Would you attend the fire, Curzon? If we wait for her to do it, we'll surely freeze. I crossed to the hearth and picked up the fire poker, a length of iron as thick as 2 fingers and long as my arm. I could crack his skull with one hard blow, but I was still barefooted and half-starved. Even if I outran the guards, I'd perish of the cold. I had to soldier my temper, for now. I knelt and poked at the dying coals. I function as an aide to the committee from Congress, Bellingham said proudly, as if I'd inquired about his position. It was a stroke of genius to become as close as I did to Morris those last months in New York. You'll remember him, young chap, flirts shamelessly, rich as Midas. Serve him first always, then Reed, for he has the ear of General Washington, then me. The other 2 fellows are good enough, but they cannot help my plans. I arranged the wood above the coals in a crisscross fashion. Morris has hinted I might be appointed to head of the commissary on account of my mercantile experience. At the very least, I ought to become a person of rank within one of the divisions responsible for supplying the army. I need your ears again, Curzon. Listen in on any and all conversations, particularly when Morris and Reed meet with anyone from headquarters. I ignored him and blew on the coals to revive them. A few weeks was all I needed. In that time, I'd learned the habits of the gentleman who was tidy, who was forgetful, who carried coin upon his person, and who left it in his chamber. I'd eat everything I could to strengthen myself for the escape. When the right moment presented itself, I'd know who to steal from, how, and in which direction to flee. The coals glowed red. There was a quiet knock on the door. Enter, Bellingham said. The door opened. The maid, sir, Gideon announced. Perfect, Bellingham said. That's all, Gideon. I blew again as the maid stepped softly across the floor. I would not alert Gideon to my plan. There was something about his manner I did not trust. Sparks finally popped. Bellingham continued conversating with himself. Morris arranged my position assisting the Congress, he chuckled. Had 2 rooms all to myself near the city tavern, far nicer than this. I bought a sturdy mare for 15 pounds and this girl for 10. The coals burst into flame. Oh, do stand up, Curzon, Bellingham said. I can hardly introduce her to your backside, can I? I stood, brushing the ashes and wood grit from my hands. Time stopped. The room was so still I could hear voices arguing in the kitchen, heavy footsteps on the floor above, the crackle of fire eating wood, horses approaching on the camp road. I recognized her right away, of course. Bellingham reached for the last potato. The tines of his fork screeched wickedly across the plate. She tried to help us nab Lockton and his foul nest of traitors, remember? No, 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 no. Candlelight caught the rage in her eyes, reflected off the scar on her cheek. 'Twas Isabel. Okay, go back, reread, do your jots. Look forward to discussing these 2 chapters after the weekend. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.